So I think we've established that this is quite a European, can I say pro-European gathering, but interestingly there are divisions on the way forward, which is not surprising. Okay, so let's make a start then. So this part of the afternoon is really in your hands. So I think in theory, I was told by the organisers to start with the short-term and move to long-term questions, but in my view, that almost never works. So I'm just going to say, who'd like to ask a question of our panel?
Okay, thanks for...
Right. This is your chance. Right, I can see one there. Now, are we doing this without the microphone? In which case, just speak up.
Just a question to Mr. Martins. Yeah, I said that right. But, you mentioned the strong euro. How are we going to go about weakening that euro? Is there a way to weaken that euro? What are the real fundamentals of sustaining that high euro compared to relative to the US?
I'd like to pass that on to the markets here because it is basically a market thing. But let me just say, people have a little bit of a perverted relationship to the currency exchange because some of them see them as the size of the crown jewels, or in that comparison. And I think when the euro started, the big mistake was that the first place that the euro exchange rate was ever set was in New Zealand because of the Earth's rotation. And they put it obviously too high, but I mean, what would they know about it anyway? That was a joke. And what happened afterwards was it declined, and everybody was over here was saying, yeah, there you see, we told you, it was sort of a sign of success or failure, and others were very worried about it. Whereas when it was really rising, the whole situation was reversed. But I think if you go to Germany, for example, and say that the euro should be weakened, they would say absolutely no way because a strong currency is like a strong power and all that kind of stuff. I'm saying it mostly for the jobs and growth creation. But I don't know if we can say, David, that we have significantly higher interest rates in Europe, if that could make the difference, because normally you push a currency up by having higher interest rates, but they're really low anyway. So I don't really think that's the explanation. Maybe you have a market angle to this?
Well, it puzzles an awful lot of people in the markets, let's be clear. I go around meeting investors all over the place, and particularly through much of the crisis, the level of the euro has been something which has puzzled them, because coming out of every financial crisis, you want a lower exchange rate, basically. The UK, things here in the UK would have been much worse if sterling hadn't collapsed in 2008. It started falling in 2007, then collapsed in 2008. Just to be clear on that, a lot of UK companies priced to market, so it didn't come through in export volumes, it came through in balance sheet repair, but that stopped the recessionary conditions getting a lot worse here in the UK. In terms of the Eurozone, every time the market perceives that things are improving, and risk appetite's improving, you have spreads coming in. In that period, the euro is actually often going up. Now, what we've been consistently telling investors is in order to spreads to come in permanently and the system to move into a good equilibrium, you need a much lower level of exchange rate. So every time the euro is going up, it's actually putting more stress on the system. In particular, it's not just an issue for trading with countries outside the Eurozone, it's a problem with intra-Eurozone trade. So a lot of Italian companies, for example, get priced out at this level of exchange rate by Chinese competition, not just in Italy, but also in, for example, Germany or in France. So it's made the issue worse. And the other thing I'll highlight to macroeconomists is that 20% of Eurozone GDP is exported outside the system. 20%. The equivalent figure for the US is about 10. Now, Ben Bernanke wants a weaker dollar. Mervyn King wants a weaker sterling. At the last press conference, he mentioned in the UK, sterling on a trade-weighted basis has gone up by 8% since last summer. Now, obviously that represents to him and the Bank of England a monetary tightening, which means that they have to do more in terms of quantitative easing or thinking about other measures to offset that impact on the UK going forwards. In terms of the ECB, absolutely, they haven't really sort of engineered a weaker euro. They haven't talked about it. A strong euro has been seen as strength in the system. That was certainly Jean-Paul Trichet's view. So that was an issue, but he's now gone, of course. How can they get the euro weaker? Well, if they actually did outright QE, which they can do under their under the Lisbon Treaty, Article 125, on the macro environment, We signed, by the way, in the UK, the same Lisbon Treaty as Germany did. So you can do quantitative easing here in the UK. You can do it in the Eurozone more generally. But you do it on inflation grounds. You do it on inflation grounds, on macro grounds, not on anything to do with bond markets. If they did that, the euro would go down. The other thing they could do to get the euro down is they could take the deposit rate, the overnight deposit rate, which is currently 0, negative, which the Danes have done. They need to cut the refi rate, which is currently 75 bips, 0.75, that needs to come down. And they could also actually intervene in the foreign exchange market itself. I mean, all these things are possible.
But let me just add to that, that bad press apparently doesn't depress the euro, because the rumors about it going down with
Have been there forever.
Yeah, so there's a big
I have to
confidence.
say, I think it would be a really daft idea. This is the one thing that has kept the world economy a bit stable, that we don't start to talk down or engineer down our exchange rates. I mean, in that sense, the euro is not destabilizing the world economy. The Japanese need a lower yen rate. I mean, everybody would like to have it, but nobody can be, and the United States certainly cannot be forever the consumer of last resort, or first resort, in fact. That should stay stable. That's why we didn't see massive protectionism, all these things that made the Great Depression worse. If you had a lower euro rate, guess who would benefit from that? The Germans, the Dutch, the Finns, and not the Greeks. I think that's really a bad idea.
I don't agree totally with you, because the strong euro was, the issue of the strong euro was a big debate in France in 2006, 2007. Yeah, quite rightly. Because the strong euro benefited one country more than anything, it's Germany. It allowed Germany to decrease its imported inflation, cheaper energy, thanks to the strong euro.
Nobody
Also,
else? Or?
yeah, everyone else. Yeah, no. Then it allowed Germany to take. Germany was able to subcontract a lot of its manufacturing process in the new member states, which did not have the euro. And a lot of the manufacturing of German products is done in it's outsourced in non-euro countries, which decreases the cost. It allowed, and for example, when the Commission wanted to put at the beginning of the year a rule saying that for a product to be considered as German, 40% of the added value needed to come from that country. The German Empress Federation opposed it successfully, because a lot of the so-called German products have only 10% of the value. It was also good, for example, for Germany has no minimum wage. It was very good for its agricultural balance. It allowed them to use Polish workers working for €5 an hour, €5 an hour.
Now
Four
Yeah,
for 4 or 5 euros an hour. And it actually penalized German exports to the rest of the world. Because the argument, I asked this question to Jean-Claude Trichet exactly a year ago. He came to my town, where he's from, Saint-Malo, for a little seminar. And he said, no, rubbish, look at the Germans. But some figures show that German exports to the rest of the world did not increase. Actually, Germany lost, but they maximized their exports to the rest of the Eurozone. A lot of the trade surplus comes from the Eurozone. And Germany has one advantage over the European economies. It is the market leader in many products. It's not competing on a price issue very often. It's competing on its image of quality, and therefore it hasn't harmed it too much. But the other countries, Italy and France, which are trying to compete, which are not market leaders, which are trying to compete on price, find it very difficult with that.
That's
And
actually
one of the other points I want to make is that Germany has never had the head of central bank has never been German, but the chief economist of the European Central have always been German until last year. And Otmar Issing, the ultimate hawk in charge of a strong euro, was the man who was actually pushing the ECB direction. So the main country which benefits from a strong euro is Germany. Another one and that's why they're so close at the moment, is China. China loves Germany, not only because of their products become a model, but because Germany is the advocate of a strong euro, which helps China's industry.
Okay, so I bet you didn't expect your innocent question. But I know that Valchar would like to come back in.
Yeah.
Okay, but just before that, so I guess many of you never heard before about the San Marlo Mafia, but now you know it exists. Okay.
No, I just want to say, you can't have it both ways. It is true, Germany benefits from the whole thing. I say that all the time too, but earlier we heard Germany is the main beneficiary of the euro. And so that's why they should also pay. And I think, yes, that's true. But then to say, so therefore they should not, they must retain the euro. And at the same time you say, when we have the euro, they are also the beneficiary and can't, you know, if we would get rid of the euro as we had designed,
I'm not asking
then
to get
the
rid of the
Germans are
euro.
the beneficiary.
Just said you have. I don't know if you
France
drop
is an exporting economy very much in the world market too. You have a choice. Either you have a weak currency and pay the interest rate, because then you always have to have this premium that you have to pay on your interest rate. It was once the idea of French and all other policymakers to say we want to have a stable currency with low interest rates. Now to say we would like to have it both ways is just, you know, there is some economic constraints here that even the French have to acknowledge.
The US have a weak currency and low interest rates.
So I'm just going to make a very general point, which some of you may wish to remember when the exam comes around, which is that when two countries have misaligned exchange rates, both lose, because the country with the low price level loses consumption, and the country with the high price level loses production. And when we talk about Germany, for example, gaining from its large export surplus, it's a loss to consumers. David, do you want to? You're sitting there quietly.
Well, the only other thing I was going to add is actually the point that you were making before. I mean, the Eurozone overall doesn't actually have a current account balance. That's the other interesting thing here. And in fact, you know, estimates are fundamentally of exchange rate, you know, fair value estimates. Don't put it too far from the current level of 130 against the dollar. I do think a weak currency would be enormously helpful. You know, to me, sorry. For everyone.
The world
issue,
economy?
No, for the Eurozone. No, the biggest risk, the OECD last week, this week published a World Economic Outlook. Their principal concern remains the Eurozone. Principal concern is not the fiscal cliff in the US, it's the Eurozone. And the concern is that financial tensions flare up again. They're talking, you know, in their risk scenario about a 40% decline in equity prices, spreads opening up another 300 basis points, credit spreads blowing out, and Eurozone GDP collapsing by around about 4%, and inflation turning negative, absolute outright deflation. That alone is a major risk still. How do you offset that risk? You need growth, and you need a weaker exchange
All
rate.
this navel gazing of the Europeans, they shouldn't quite forget that there's a world out there, the world economy for which they have also responsibility. The US needs to adjust, the Japanese have a hard time, the Swiss cannot be the abode of all capital movements of this world. You shouldn't tinker with the exchange rate, that's really my firm belief. And the Chinese, it's a good thing that they can export. It's the biggest poverty relief program that the world has ever seen. The world would not have any reduction in poverty rates if they were not the Chinese. And it's a good thing.
Can I just say, because the question was actually to me. I just regretted to say that the euro, I found it too high at the moment, and I found it unfairly too high. I think we're taking too much of a burden. But I also have to say, if you're interested in researching this, can you try to research and come back to me in a year's time and tell me why Europe's exports didn't boom or was destroyed when the euro went from 0.8 to 1.6 to the dollar, and why the American exports were not booming during that same period. There seems to be a little bit of two worlds here. One is the textbook world, and one is the other part of the world. And by the way, I also agree that it's not always a good idea to devaluate, and I wasn't actively promoting that. Let me say that I said very clearly that the euro has prevented all these devaluations we always had in Europe, and that has been good for all of us. But I also think that devaluations are immoral. And I know British will not agree with that, but it is pushing the problem to somebody else. It is making our neighbor. But there's also a punishment. You know, I come from a cold country in Scandinavia, and here's a little bit of advice if it's cold, because we nearly have Scandinavian temperatures here. But we always say if you really freeze in the winter, then try to pee in your pants, because it gives you a nice and warm feeling for a little while. And then it becomes really cold. And the real cold is when the inflation then starts kicking in, because you cannot evaluate without taking the risk of importing.
Okay, so while things are cooling down,
I'm sorry if I'm too academic here, but
we're all enjoying the sensation.
Okay, try it.
Any of you like to come into this?
I'm scared.
Okay, so,
That was a good start.
yeah. So let me perhaps put a question to the panel. So, if we think about the problem of growth in jobs, which is where we concluded the first part of the meeting. There are different, in fact, you can think that there are different experiments being carried out in the world today about how to simultaneously promote prosperity and carry out a fiscal adjustment. And loosely speaking, you can think of it as the French and the British recipes. And so the French recipe is you put up taxes to try to maintain spending on social priorities and job creation. And the British one is that you try to rein in spending and put the main burden on the spending side. And so there are different pros and cons of these different outcomes. Something that's often urged in favour of spending reduction is ultimately the answer has to lie in private investment. Reining in the government sector will encourage private investments, and there's a lot of research. I think of Alacina and Javatsi who've got a recent paper on this. And then there's, on the side of putting up taxes in order to maintain government spending, is the standard Keynesian argument about the need to promote the circular flow of aggregate demand. So, Hans, if I think of where you ended up, it sounded as if you were on. Well, okay, but perhaps I should ask you, where do you locate yourself, and where do our other panelists locate themselves in this debate?
For me, it's very clear that Europe needs dramatic structural reform over longer term, and I actually hinted at a few of the things we need to do. But I think we should not spend the time of discussing something that works in 5 years, because I think there's an urgent need now. So I want a kickstart of the economy. If the public budgets can't do it, let's use the financial markets to do it, because they brought us into this anyway, so let them help us out of it, right? So that's why I advocate the PPPs in the way I just did it. And I think the proposal, and I've never hidden my point of view to anybody who matters about this, is that it is too unambitious, because anything to be guaranteed by the EU budget is notoriously inefficient because it's too small. But can I just make a general point about, and don't come and tell me that I'm only talking about the growth injection. I am also very much aware of the need for the structural reform, not only for global competitiveness of Europe, but certainly also to address the issues of the demographics, the adverse demographics. But there is a complicated thing about the public sector, and I have enormous difficulties in explaining this in the US, because to me it's not the size of the public sector that matters, it's what it does and how efficiently it does it, right? Because one thing you can look at is the perfect nanny state. I remember when somebody had turned on Fox News. I was in the US under the last election campaign before 2008. And no, it was just after Obama had just been elected. And there was somebody calling him a European. That was really bad. And then somebody called him outright communist. But then came the ultimate insult to him. He's more like the Swedish. And for a Dane, this was obviously perfect, you know. That is the ultimate insult you can give to an American. And the point is that if you look at the Scandinavian economies, even the most conservative US think tank in their economic freedom indexes actually rank them as having very high economic freedom. Because we have a nanny state in Scandinavia, or they have in Scandinavia, I don't live there anymore, but it's costly, and it has high tax rates, high tax rates, but it doesn't mean that the government ever intervenes in the labor market, intervenes into industry policy or anything like that. The easiest place in Europe to lay off people is actually in Denmark. And the reason you can do it is because you have this extreme flexibility, but you also have the security system then, so that social policy doesn't become like in France, protecting people in their existing job, but it becomes protecting the individual. And combined with what we call active labor market policy, basically say if you lose your job, this is the challenge to get a new and a better job. You see, and you see on the competitiveness on the economies and so on, that the public sector, if it's uncorrupt and if it's efficient and if it stays away from regulating the markets, it can benefit competitiveness. Let me say something like, for example, childcare institutions. Come on, this is not the job of the state. Well, to me, it's a clear subsidy of industry. Because it basically means if you have good institutions like that, you get more women out on the labor market, you address the demographic needs, but you also increase competitiveness that way. So I don't have this clear-cut vision, you know, that if you cut the public sector, then the private sector just booms. The Danish employers would, or the Swedish would hate to see the welfare state go because it helps them actually to be competitive.
Yeah, well, I would agree totally with the class on that. The public,
Totally.
But
you also do that in some
public is, you know, it used to be the mantra used to be public bad, private good, and it's not been the case. Private spending hasn't been necessarily that conducive to the improving the economic performance of some countries due to the shortcomings of shareholder capitalism. That's another issue. We've seen the Western companies, the European companies, not investing in the future and privileging their shares at the expense of the future and of investment. One of the problems. And at the same time, I think that too much tax kills the tax is not necessarily the mantra we should still be adopting. When you look at the competitiveness of the country, how do you measure the competitiveness of the country? Is it export per head? In that case, high tax countries such as the Scandinavian countries export far more per head of population than Japan, than the US, than anyone else. So having a high tax is not necessarily a bad thing if the money, as you said, is well spent. And France is accused of being a high tax country, and lately has been under the limelight because the idea of taxing the rich. I think a bit too much. I personally think a 75% tax is a bit ridiculous, but it's true that we must restore the bank base, the tax base, and make it more equal. What we've seen over the last 10-15 years is not so much that the deficits have not been so much due to an increase in public spending, but a lot of it has been due to a loss of tax revenue and taxation on corporations. We see that the small and medium-sized company in France, the average rate is 33%. The small and medium-sized company pay 25% of their profit. The one who are listed on the stock exchange, the 40 top companies in France, pay on average 8% of their profit tax. And one of the big problems in Europe, I think, is this tax competition between countries. I think it is a scandal. I think it is part of the image of Europe based on competition rather than cooperation, and which has led to a loss of public income for all countries concerned. And I'm very happy to see that now, because of some famous cases involving Google, Starbucks, and who else, now we're trying to put an end to the process of fiscal tax optimization, which means that large companies can declare their losses in high tax countries, such as France, and their profits in low tax countries, such as Ireland. And that is the big problem. And I think that one of the things we need in Europe is to move, at least in the Eurozone, to move towards tax harmonization. I think it's a crucial issue. It's absolutely a key issue, because companies want to work here with the biggest market in the world. We should be able to impose some some rules and tax contributions to the companies which are benefiting massively from the amount of public spending, whether it's education, whether it is childcare, whether it's sickness benefit. Let's not forget that welfare program at the beginning were there to guarantee that there would be consumption which would prevent a repeat of the Great Recession of the 1930s. And it's public spending, which actually 3 years ago, in April 2009, the economists, always a good judge of what's good and what's right, say that in the new pecking order, there was a cover, new pecking order in Europe was France. And why? Because they had a good welfare system which helped to soften the blow of the crisis. People were still able to consume and spend, which was good for business as a whole and for economic activity. And that's why we had less recession. But now the tune has changed.
Okay, so I'll go quickly to Val, Charlotte, and then to David.
I just wanted to say, I mean, I always think that structural reforms, supply side reforms work best in a general atmosphere of expansion. And for that you need stabilization, if not even expansion of demand. That seems to me quite clear. Even the financial system, financial sector here in Britain actually understands that they are pragmatist Keynesians, as far as I read the FT, and quite right too. The problem in Greece, the problem we have in the Eurozone is now that, of course, those who could afford to expand a bit don't want to, even though the Germans say one thing and do not quite do the other thing. I mean, in principle, they should have a surplus at the moment because they really are in an upturn. Quietly, they let it happen that there is a deficit. So you also always have to take with a grain of salt what the German older liberal and what they really do. But it is true that the Greeks, the Spaniards, the Portuguese would need some demand stabilization. And I would really think we need to change the law. The Greeks they actually have funds for investment there, but in their firefighting for austerity, and yet another troika visit, they just never get round to devising some programs. This is what the EU should do. They should take money in their hands and pay the Greek pensioners and so on. So to be seen that they actually finance things that stabilizes this country in a social sense, and not always be seen as the one that says, cut everything down and then reform structurally in a shrinking economy. Because the Greek problem was really not that they had high social spending. They have one of the lowest social expenditure rates in the OECD. What their problem was is that there was nothing that said that in terms of social assistance or social security for anybody, very patchy pension system. The only thing where the welfare state was with public sector. So everybody, every family wanted to have at least one public sector job because the rest of the family became that. That's a clientelistic system, and you need to build a welfare state there. Then they can shrink their public sector too.
David, can I come with a very concrete proposal for a new directive? Because I said I was a Scandinavian pragmatist, and I've got the solution now. We make a new directive which makes it compulsory for all Germans to spend 4 weeks of holiday in Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and spend a minimum of €1,000 per day.
Just one word on the tax evasion. If you're a small self-employed firm in Greece and you don't get anything from the state, well then you don't want to pay your taxes either. There is a give and take, and at the moment that state is a failed state, and you need to rebuild that state.
Well, I think I'm going to move to Germany.
Absolutely. I was going to say, I think from a market perspective, the key thing here is growth. The market is going to punish economies that slip into deep recession, hence my concerns about the Netherlands, because the Dutch economy now is back in serious recession. They've got massive private sector leverage on the balance sheet. If you strip away financials, private sector indebtedness in the Netherlands is 300% of GDP. Same as Belgium, same as Spain, and same as Portugal. Hence, my go to Netherlands, their concern is that they're going to lose their AAA. And their banking system, along with Germany, Finland, and Luxembourg, have been bailing out banks in Spain, France, and everywhere else through the Target 2 system. So this is an ongoing problem. Basically, if you go back to the example of Finland and Scandinavia, when they faced a banking crisis, they delayed tightening fiscal policy until 95. Their recoveries have been underway for 3 years. What we're doing at the moment is we're hitting the system with more fiscal austerity even before the system is actually engineered out of recession. The US is at the moment reaching escape velocity, and now they're going to tighten fiscal policy. History will write this up far better. The other thing I'd highlight also about the Scandinavians is that a banking crisis to me is a negative supply shock. So you know after a banking crisis, banks can't lend, won't lend, households, corporates won't borrow, can't borrow. Takes years to repair. Trend growth after a banking crisis is always going to be a lot weaker. In the case of Scandinavia, they had a positive supply shock in the form of information and communication technology. They didn't see it coming, but that took up the running. Basically, that engineered that Scandinavia went back to actually fairly healthy growth rates in the second half of the 90s. In the case of the Eurozone, the European Commission now believes trend growth in the Eurozone is 0.5%, 0.5%. Now, coming back to your question, Mark, about how you should do it optimally in terms of tax rises and public spending cuts. In terms of the Eurozone, of course, the policy decision has been a lot about fiscal devaluation. You can't devalue the currency inside the system, so you use fiscal policy to try and improve your competitiveness. So what you do is you raise taxes, particularly indirect taxes, to basically reduce domestic demand, improve your current account position, and you try and foster exports through structural reforms. The issue, as I was describing in my presentation, is that these indirect tax rises have hit the consumer, led to weaker GDP, which the markets have then punished. Structural reforms only show their benefits 7 to 11 years down the road. Now, I'm a former mathematician, so I like prime numbers. 7 to 11 to me are very important numbers. Normally, structural reforms take 7 to 11 years to show through. So to me, it's quite obvious what needs to happen. You need more policy stimulus to actually start recoveries. Now, if you don't want a weaker exchange rate, then I don't know what is going to happen. You know, obviously, you relax monetary policy for tighter fiscal policy. You do that through quantitative easing, which may result in a weaker currency down the line anyway. But that's
the total consensus of the panel. It's clearly a failed panel.
Okay, so since the panel all agrees, let's see if we can get some disagreement in the audience. So there's a question here. Anybody else waiting to ask a question? Go ahead. So it's Neil and then Sean.
Question from more of a physical science perspective. Claude and Jack, one of the issues you seem to imply in your presentation was that one of the key problems the EU faces in trying to construct a fiscal union is democracy. Is whether the EU can do so using democratic mechanism. And then we have Hans is called the EU to go the pragmatic way. Now, in the context of European integration, the pragmatic way is usually the elitist, top-down, non-democratic, the classic neo-functionalist pattern of European integration. So I guess the question is, does the panel think that building a political community like the European Union is by necessity, has to be top-down elitist in nature, and therefore to a large extent ignores the public in that process?
It's been, that's the problem with the European integration process. It's been a top-down process from the start. For 30 years, the EU vowed EEC developed behind closed door, led by some people with a vision, and it was not something that people talked about, except when I came to Britain, people were very upset about losing eventually decimal system, a few things like that, the fisheries and so on, but it only, EU became, when they tried to democratize EU with the Maastricht Treaty to make it more political, that's when actually the problems started, but there was a clash between the vision of the EU and the understanding of the people. It was very complex. Most people did not understand. It's a very difficult project to explain. I mean, many of you are doing European studies here, and it's not something. It's really a topic for anoraks, as you say, and really to understand the ins and outs of the process. And the EU has developed, the EEC developed with a total democratic deficit. And that was the role of the European Union. I always saw it that way. The European Union is there to think about the long term, while governments all have to face elections and looking in the short term. And that's been, and today we see that these conflicts, the conflict between the two logic will be at the heart of the problem of the European Union, because we see that the conception of the European Union has promoted by Van Rompuy, Barroso, what we've heard, is still very technocratic rules. We know best, even though people don't like it. We want these reforms, you have to become, we want this structural reform, we want this, we want that, we want more coercion, we want less sovereignty. At the same time, we're talking about democracy, and as you know, democracy is a messy business. Things can change, especially with public opinion can be manipulated, etc. You have trends. That is the problem, in a way, is that at the heart of the concept of political union is this conflict between, on one hand, the awareness of what we should be doing is best, and the other hand, the lack of understanding of the population and the uncertainty of democracy. And the big problem also stems from the way European Union has been managed. It's a very ambiguous project that doesn't help actually constitute a European demos. Because at the heart, if you want to have the democracy, you have to have a certain degree of European consciousness. We're all in the same boat. Everyone will agree that the future, we're all in the same boat. Every country is too small to defend its interests in the new global world. So the European Union can defend it. But that's why we need a project. Which kind of Europe? Is it, once again, the Europe, the big question, we always go back to the question which Joschka Fischer asked, Quo vadis Europa? Where are we going? What is our project? Where are we trying to go? And trying to build consensus. People. There was only one time when I felt that there was a European consensus, a European demos. It was in 2003, when most people in Europe opposed the intervention, the war in Iraq. But this time, all Europeans felt the same. But this time, they were let down by the governments because the governments were divided. So, can you have both united and united governments at the same time?
Belgium.
Anyway, I think we see at the moment political union created from below. It's just not the happy, harmonious process that we had all hoped for. But when Germans know now something about the Greek pension system, and it's as distorted as things always are, that is part of political integration. We may not like it, but that's what it is. Or that our newspapers here or in Germany or in Netherlands report what Italian newspapers write about it. That is political integration. It's just if we do not, and there the institution building for which you earlier asked does come in. If we do not manage to build institutions such that our diversity actually works like an insurance mechanism, where diversity is a good thing. We don't all want to be alike. This is why I don't like this whole notion of we have to be an optimum currency area. No country in the world is an optimum currency area, including this one, where one interest rate has deindustrialized the north and not even have the housing bubble in the south under control. So you have exactly the problem in miniature that we have in the euro area as a whole. That's why you need then to have a budget that works like an insurance mechanism, where you actually say that not everybody is at the same time on the same cycle. Is a good thing, because then we don't, have to use our policies on it. But if people don't feel that actually it aggravates situations, this is the bad equilibrium about which you talk all the time, that the Spaniards are pushed into a bad equilibrium that they wouldn't have without it. Well, then we have political union that is of that sort, where you have separatist movements like Spanish or Italian or Belgian state. And that is what you cannot survive, because the political lineages are not strong enough. And in that sense, we need to, and that is an elitist project. See who spends a wonderful Saturday in here is pro-European. These are the elites, I'm afraid. But that's modern politics anywhere. It's in the nation state as well. We have to live with that, but somehow Europe must make a difference to people's lives in a positive sense. They will not be interested in my Eurobond ideas, but somehow the Eurobond idea must stabilize the economies and people's jobs and stuff.
So
I was just trying to, exactly what I said was to basically build on what I feel that people need most now. And that's why, I think plan Barroso has put forward, that blueprint is absolutely theoretically perfect. It's just more or less, after the textbook. But I just don't think it has a chance on earth, and I don't think we should waste the time on it, because there's no way the Germans are going to vote for a constitutional change because of that. There's no way I think that this will be adopted even in Spain, and it will consume a lot of elitist energy over 5 years, just to concentrate and work on these things. And that's why I'm saying let's get some confidence back in Europe and do what people need most, and begin to think about the people, not about the elites. And then I agree with the one who said that structural reforms take, I normally say 5 to 7 years, but whatever. They take, the problem is they take always longer than your mandate, right? And that's why it requires so much political bravery, because like Schröder in Germany didn't understand that, so he made the big labor market reform at the end of this period, right, just before the election. And that's where the bad things come, and not the good things. And now Merkel then takes all of the good news out of it. But I also think you have to consider that over the last couple of years, after the last treaty change, everybody was talking about the big new role of the European Parliament. I mean, come on, they got nicer suits and better cars, but they have got a lot less and less influence. The power is concentrated in one place, and that's by the men who don't want it, and that's Hammer's problem. And the reason is that this crisis, probably, I think it's that, has brought everything back to the heads of state and government. They are the ones that can organize this. They meet just right outside my window, and I tell you, during last year, every month we couldn't get to work because there was a summer meeting all the time, and they take very detailed discussions that they were never intended to. But EU, that's why the EU democracy is quite simply not strong enough to carry us through this, right? Because we're too intergovernmental at the moment, and the only way you can do it is go back to referenda in all the different various member states. And when that elitist thinking then meets the people, then you will see the same as happened when France and Holland voted no.
Well, I was thinking of George Soros' anecdote, not that he's told me this himself, but he's written about it in the FT. Basically, he told Europe's leaders 2 years ago to move to fiscal union then, if you don't do it now, the situation macro-wise will get a lot worse, unemployment will be rising, and at that point it's going to be much more difficult to sell that to the electorates. And obviously that is the issue. The markets, as I keep describing, the markets are in a better space than they were prior to Draghi's verbal intervention in the summer. Actually, one thing I didn't mention was just prior to him speaking, the outflows that Spain was seeing at that point were more severe capital outflows than any emerging market had seen in an emerging market crisis. The IMF have made this very clear. They were just watching Spain disintegrate, which is why his words were so important. Now, the markets will buy the view that there is going to be eventually a Eurobond. They just want to know that there is there is something on the table. A Euro bill, for example, that I think would be a partial solution. The other thing in terms of banking union, I should have added as well earlier, the markets understand there is a huge flaw at the moment. There is no effective deposit insurance scheme. The IMF have heavily criticised European policymakers on this as well. Without an effective deposit insurance scheme, you've still got this risk of deposit leakage through the system, turning into outright deposit flight. That's why they couldn't let Greece go. The reason they couldn't let Greece go is at that point you get contagion coming through the system because you've got no effective backstop for Spanish deposits, apart from the Bundesbank and the other central banks providing liquidity on demand into the system. So this remains a huge issue. There isn't a deposit insurance scheme on the table. So, at the moment, that remains a huge problem in the market's mind, and also the IMF. Don't listen to me. Read the IMF on this. The IMF have been very critical. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to finish probably at 3:30. Sean's indicated a question. Anybody else want? Okay, so now everybody's right. Okay, so we'll take them all at once. So you'll. Okay, so there's a question here, and okay, you, and then I don't know if I'm missing anything. You, and then you want a second bite of the cherry. So okay, sorry. Okay, so let's start with you.
It's not exactly an exact question or a topic, which might be hard to cover in 8 minutes, but I just like to throw this into the general talk. We've heard a lot about the locomotive industries of Europe, all the Western big industries. I'm from Eastern Europe, and I'd like to get a few words on how the Western European political leadership or economic leadership looks at these Eastern European countries. What do you expect from them? Do you think they could be as strong parts of the political community that the EU is trying to create, and this democracy, EU democracy, as the Western countries, or can they be integrated? Because right now they're not integrated. That's for sure. There's a huge line still between those countries that were in the EU pre-2004 and the ones that joined afterwards. Any thoughts or advice on that?
Okay, so there's a big question about Eastern Europe.
That's right. So just general perspective.
Up there. Yes, you.
Yeah.
Yep.
I believe it was Mr. Martins who said like that debt mutualization and issuing of Eurobonds is theoretically a good idea. That is a great blueprint, but that it's politically infeasible. I believe. I hope I didn't distort like what you said.
I said no.
No, okay, and I would like to hear like the opinion of the other panelists, because he said we shouldn't waste our time devising a treaty that in the end will be rejected by most of European countries or by some European countries. So I'd like to hear the opinion of the other panelists, like is it politically feasible to, to make
Okay.
it happen?
You wanted to ask a?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's Ms. Shackle after that. Sorry, I must say.
Cloud.
Okay. You talked a lot about the Greek problem, and obviously that is one of the major problems. And I read an interesting article in The Economist. I don't always condone The Economist's views. It's like, can be a bit overly free market. But anyway, it talked about one major solution to the Greek look historically, and it said that none of the really big debt problems that have happened in the past have really been solved, specifically in regards to the IMF lending out huge amounts of money. None of the big debt problems have really been solved until the debt's just been cut completely, and the creditors have just been forced to give up on the money that they've been owed. And with regards to Greece, is that something that would be feasible, and would you guys condone it?
Okay. Now we have.
Sure.
No, he's passing, which is good. Thank you. We have 5 minutes left, and that's a minute and a few seconds each. If you've been asked a question directly, I suggest you focus on that. We'll just go on the panel for one last short intervention.
I agree with you. Greece should be let off the hook. We will pay only in postponed time, but it requires that the banking systems also can take the hit. And that's why the recapitalization must be a priority. And for the moment, I think one should forget about all these debt protections and let's just see when you can let debt default. In Eastern Europe, to say that they are not integrated, I think is wrong. The Vienna Initiative was the initiative where one said immediately, the banks don't withdraw now from Eastern Europe. It actually stabilized Eastern Europe to that extent because the ECB in that initiative basically signaled, we make you temporarily members of the Eurozone, you get a swap line if you need euros. And this is what allowed Eastern Europe to have orderly devaluations. And this is, in that sense, also a myth to think the euro, look how good it is to be outside of the euro area when you look at Eastern Europe today. It was because they were half in and half out, which happened to be the best of both worlds.
Jacques.
Yeah. For Eastern Europe, one of the big miracle country in Europe, in the EU, is Poland. At the moment, in terms of economic performance and so on. Poland is becoming a key player, and I think that in the future, I think Poland is destined to become a core country, unlike Britain, for example, which moved to the sideline and should be replaced by Poland. We already have a Weimar Triangle, Paris, Berlin, Poland. Poland will be the big player. Will want probably to join the Euro at some point. So I'm not sure. Besides that, I must admit I can't give you any kind of competent answers, but I realize that Poland is a lot over the rest of Eastern Europe. A great haircut we should have done it from the start, because otherwise that would have probably nipped the problem in the bud. The Eurozone crisis was allowed to develop when we wanted to punish for moral hazard when we could have come to the rescue, and markets expected. They really expected that there's no bailout clause, which is Article 102 or 103 of the ECB treaty, would not apply. That basically, if the chips were down for a problem which was quite containable, which represented a very small amount of the GDP, other countries would have come to the rescue. If we had acted, then the Eurozone crisis could have been nipped into the bud. It would have become as tragic as it became. Now it's too late. There was the latest settlement. Okay, it's a progress, but everyone knows it's big enough. From what I read in the German press and so on, they know very well. Okay, the solution which was adopted will hold until the German election, but that's the main thing, the most important thing, that there's no more demand on the public purse, but that if we really want to achieve the objective of 120% debt by 2020, will the public, the public share of the debt, up to now it's only private contributors, private holders of sovereign which have been hit, which have to take a haircut. Now countries will have to take a haircut, and it will cost us. But it's also been shown that a Greek exit would be so damaging to economic prospects for everyone that it will happen. We'll have to. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, but I just think we shouldn't talk about Eastern Europe as one bloc, because they're quite different and they have different alignments, you know, in many ways. One thing I would like the Eastern Europeans not to be is to be like Hungary is today, but
I'm from Hungary, that's why I asked the question.
no,
Oh, are you?
so,
It doesn't mean that I agree with everything.
sorry, but I really need to just to finish because we have a train to catch. But I just want to say that I think you are different, but I think you're integrating, and I think this was everybody's will. It was a huge project and a big responsibility for Europe. Why the others don't want to say whether they disagree with me on the treaty, I don't know, but it's probably another question for me. But on Greece, it's very clear for me that when Greece joined the Euro 2 years later than others, everybody said that they shouldn't do it. And then, you know, yeah, but come on, they're only 2% of the euro economy. If things go bad, nobody will discover it, you know. But that actually didn't go that way. And I think that their problems are so special and so bad all the way around that I would have recommended to simply adopt Greece as a kind of a transfer union. But as we can't do that, then have made a special development fund for Greece, taking this as a 15 to 20 years period, because it's not something you can fix in 1 or 2 days. But it should have been with very clear milestones about structural reforms, but really give it time to work. I think it takes 15 to 20 years to turn the situation around in Greece.
Thank you.
All I can say from a market research, everyone knew that Greece was going to default a long time before it did. And everyone knew after March, when they did the first haircut, that would be the end of it. And everyone now knows what we've seen in the last few days is the end of it. There will have to be a further write down the official holdings, but that won't happen until after the German elections, until after basically Greece is back in primary surplus. And moreover, the ECB will probably transfer the bonds it has on its balance sheet over to the ESM, and then will take the hit. In terms of financial history, write-downs, litter financial history following financial crises. The one thing I'd add about the Eurozone is if you look at private sector non-financial debt as a share of Eurozone GDP, it has not fallen at all in the last few quarters. In the UK, it's coming down like that from a higher level, but it's almost the same level now as the Eurozone. The Eurozone overall has not come down. So what does that tell you? There's going to be more write-downs.
Thank you. So I have one announcement before we close. Deloitte's will be available out there for networking and refreshments after the meeting. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists, who I think have done an excellent job this afternoon. Thank you very, very much.